Welcome back to Painting with Bennett. I am, in fact, Bennett, shocker, I know, and this time I'll be painting Ignatia from the Renowned Heroes pack. As always, this is just my personal approach to replicate the card art. Feel free to use or ignore any parts of this walkthrough as you prefer. Before priming the mini, I do some optional mold line cleanup. There's one big one running all the way up the right side, going up the side of the arm as well. This mold line continues down the left side of the mini, and is most noticeable on the left shoulder pad and the upper left leg. There are also mold lines running around the edge of the waist cloak, but these ones feel more hidden and probably aren't as big of a deal if you leave them on the mini. As always, mostly I just carefully scrape them off with an X-Acto knife, mainly focusing on the big flat surfaces where the mold line will be more apparent. I started off the painting by priming the model with a dark gray. I used my airbrush because of some rainy weather, but I feel like I should give my usual disclaimer that you can really do just fine without one. Rattle cans also work well. I zenithal highlighted the mini with a very light gray, then sprayed around the fiery hair with pure white, and I also applied this pure white to the top folds of the cloak while I was at it. If you're using rattle cans, maybe try priming with a light gray, and then do a spritz of white directly from above. Then I take a big makeup brush and I dry brush the entire mini white to pick out all of those edges. On to getting all the major colors blocked in. I used Occultist Cloak speed paint on the entirety of the torso, the arms, and the legs, as well as any general odds and ends. I tried to avoid the skin for the most part, but it's no big deal if a little bit splashes onto it here and there. Then I base the skin in Vallejo Frozen Flesh. I think this is a really good color match, but don't go and buy the entire skin tone set that this comes in just for this color. Any grayish purple will do, or just take a gray color and mix a little bit of purple into it. Anyway, I applied 2 thin coats of this to establish a nice solid base coat. I also decided that I would put this on the upper chest, where I originally put some speed paint before. After that I used Fire Drake speed paint for the book. It doesn't really matter what you use, any sort of brown or tan or reddish color is fine. And as a side note on the speed paint colors, when I'm selecting them, I find it really helps to look at the descriptive names on the side of the bottle to better guess how the color will actually look in real life. It's so much easier, for me at least, to envision how brownish orange or blackish blue-gray will look on the mini, as opposed to something nebulous like Fire Drake or Occultist Cloak. I put 2 different reds on my palette. The brighter one is Poppy Red, and the darker one is Slaughter Red with a little bit of Grim Black added to it. Then I roughly blended these onto the waist cloak, putting the brighter red color on the outer raised edges of the cloak, and the darker color everywhere else, and just sort of mashing them together in the middle. Maybe it's just because I get lucky, but I feel like wet blending speed paints together tends to work out pretty well for me. It feels like the colors really nicely blend together on their own, sort of, and you only need to do really minimal actual pushing the paint around with your brush. Next up is the fiery hair, where I opted to use regular acrylics as opposed to more speed paints, which should help to keep the recesses from getting darker than the raised areas. I started with the front half of the hair, applying yellow at the base of the hair, and then quickly putting some orange down in the middle of the hair and pushing the paint together a bit to blend it. I did the same thing while the orange was still wet, adding the darker red color to the tip of the hair and blending that together with the orange pretty roughly. After doing the front side of the hair, I turned the model around to do the same thing on the back. This time I worked in the opposite order. It doesn't really matter which order you apply these colors in, just do whatever you want. Just to get colors on all the different surfaces, I mix up a sort of khaki brown speed paint to put on the base. I probably used about 1 drop of brownish decay and 4 or 5 drops of pallid bone. I keep using different paints and methods to paint the bases on my guards minis, but hopefully this will end up demonstrating that the exact color matching doesn't really matter that much. But, I mean, we'll see when I put them all next to each other if you think that's the case or not. But hopefully, giving the base a brown wash and a tan or khaki dry brush will go a long way towards making it look close enough to match. Then on the card art, we can see that there's a lot of colored trim, mostly red but with some gold as well. Just to keep things easy, I just start by painting all of it red. I put some of the burnt red color from before on my brush, and I wipe most of it off on a paper towel. Then I swipe it along the edges, almost doing something like dry brushing, but with a bit of wet paint still on the brush. I do this on all the edges and ropes and details I think should be colored this way, making sure to also do the necklaces, as well as the trim on the knee pads and leg armor and such. Then the red should be a pretty decent undercoat for the gold, so now I take a good gold color and I use the same method to apply that to the surfaces I think should be gold. This is mostly the gauntlets, the belt buckle, and just the details on the book. I also picked a few more random things, like the symbol on the backpack and the edge on the front of the waistcloth thing, to be this gold color as well. But you can more or less pick out whatever details you prefer to have this gold trim as opposed to the red one. Honestly, I think it's pretty much just personal preference. Now we at least have colors on all the surfaces, which if you've watched some of my other videos, you've probably picked up that this is my preferred way to do things. From here, I can evaluate the model and decide what things to work on next, and each part will fit better into the context of the whole painted mini, as opposed to painting, shading, and highlighting one specific part and not really knowing how it'll look next to all the other colors. So next is just a handful more steps I want to do before getting to the first stopping point. First, the skin is just a flat base coat right now, so let's fix that with some simple shading and layered highlights. I mixed Druchii Violet with some Nuln Oil to make a nice dark purple wash, and I applied that all over the skin. You could use a thinned down speed paint or acrylic paint as a wash as well, or just add a tiny bit of purple paint into a black wash. Whatever floats your boat will work. I'm usually pretty critical of Citadel paints, especially because they're so expensive, but I do still really like their washes. Once that's dry, I start layering on highlights with my base coat color of Frozen Flesh, and then I mix in a pale flesh tone to apply a few more highlights. With that done, I make another wash, this time Nuln Oil with a tiny bit of blue ink added in. I put this wash all over the black clothes, including all the red and gold trim, as well as the book. For the fun of it, since the blue is also a great color to use to shade red, I put this wash in the deeper folds of the waist cloak, especially the area closer to the waist, and then I feather it out with a damp brush. As you'll see in just a little bit, in retrospect I wouldn't mix my own blue ink into this, Ideally, you'd just use a blue wash or do a better job of mixing a custom wash than what I did. But anyway, with that foreshadowing all teed up, in general now our colors are looking nice and shaded. I think from this point you could call the model done wherever you like and have a great tabletop result. So I recommend just treating everything else I do in this video as extra optional steps. Take what parts you think are useful, do them if you want, and don't bother with some or even all of the next steps if you don't want to. Now that through editing magic the wash is already dry, it's time for some highlights. I started with the red trim, taking my burnt red color from before and mixing in a little bit of a brighter, more vibrant red. I started applying this to the red trim again, this time only applying it to some of the trim, leaving the part of each section I think would be in shadow as that darker red color. A lot of the trim has this little rope texture, so if you want you can either carefully dry brush here, or just swipe your brush carefully along it to follow that texture a bit. I do another pass with that pure bold pyrrole red color, and then one more with some orange mixed in. I ended up actually going back and mixing some off-white ivory color into this orange to make one final strong highlight, which I applied very sparingly. With those colors still on my palette, I also take my bold pyrrole red and prep it on a decently large dry brush. I use this to dry brush the waistcloth, making sure to heavily apply it towards the outer edges. Then I take my red and orange mix and do the same, this time being a bit more gentle with it and keeping it towards the outer edges even more. And then I do an even more gentle one with a mix of orange and off-white. Finally, an edge highlight of orange on some of those raised folds will really make it pop. Now this mini is really starting to come to life. Everything looks so much more defined now. But I'm also noticing that small issue I foreshadowed before. I guess the bluish-black wash dried a bit too thick on the cloak, and the paint dried with some light bluish-white spots showing in the recesses. So I fixed that by taking my burnt red color, mixing in some black, and thinning it down with a bit of water, and then applying that over the problem areas. Then with that fixed, it's back to the highlights. I highlight the gold by mixing silver and gold together and carefully applying that. I made sure my brush didn't have too much paint on it, which prevented the metallic paint from flowing off my brush and getting into all the shaded recesses. I also highlighted the glove a lot more heavily on the side next to the flaming hair, since that would naturally be receiving more light. I do a final highlight with almost pure silver, really trying to push those brightest highlights bright. I didn't apply this on very many surfaces though, I tried to keep it pretty restrained. Then I switched over to refining the black clothing. I mixed a desaturated blue with some black, thinned it with a good amount of water, and applied this to the recesses and the areas that felt too light. I switched to using the desaturated blue color then to apply a highlight, and then did another highlight or two by mixing in some light gray. After that, I applied a very thin layer of black paint in the shadows to darken them down even more. And just a quick interlude to dry brush the base, once again using different colors than in my previous videos, just to put to the test the idea that the exact base colors don't really matter. Now I'm switching over to the star of the show, the flaming hair and the sort of crackled lava effect on the face. The hair already looks good, but I want to make it look great. It's a lot easier to get vibrant yellow and orange colors when painting them over white, so first I applied a pure white to the eye sockets. I thinned the white with some water and applied it heavily into the middle of the hair, where it runs nicely into all of the recesses. This will help to give it the glowing from within sort of look, where the inside of the hair will appear brighter than the outer strands of hair. I used a large damp brush to feather the white paint out a bit, as well as to pull off some white paint from any areas that had too much. To start tinting the hair, then I mixed yellow and white together, thinned it down a bit, and put that over most of the white paint in the recesses. The orange has sort of been taken over by the white and yellow, so I thinned my orange down and painted that over the middle of the hair again, as well as the front bangs. I did a couple passes of this to build up the color until it felt right, and to keep my gradient looking somewhat smooth. I did a little bit more back and forth after this, applying thin layers of the yellowy cream color and the orange back just wherever it felt right. My main advice is to not stress about exactly how to paint it, just use thin layers of paint and mess around with them, and just try to have fun seeing what sort of result you can get. But also my other more concrete piece of advice is to try not to let the white and yellow overpower the flame too much. Having a good amount of orange and red on it will help the yellow part to look even brighter, and make it look nice and vibrant with all that contrast. To paint the sort of cracked, fiery face look, I actually didn't start with white again this time. I started with a strong, vibrant red. I painted the eyebrows and tried to carefully paint some wiggly lines going from the hair into the middle of the face. Then I did some layered highlights using mixes of my orange and yellow and white colors, picking random spots in the lines to place the highlights. I over-highlighted almost up to white, and then I put my yellow paint back over these lines to tint them, and put this over the eyes as well at the same time. Then I put a tiny bit of white back into the middle of the eyes, as well as the eyebrows, to brighten them back up a bit. I was also a bit messy with my paint application on the eyes, so I used some orange to outline the eyes and give them a nice border. And just for the fun of it, I mixed up a dark red glaze and put that on the end of the hair to increase the contrast even more. Then I move on to painting a basic object source lighting effect, making the hair look like it's casting its glow onto the surrounding surfaces. I started first with the Nuclear Sunrise speed paint, which was fine but was a little too thin. I painted this onto the inner side of the raised arm, as well as the parts of the neck and shoulders close to the flames. I could have kept going with several more layers of this speed paint, but just to try something new I switched to using an ink instead, this blazing ink from P3, and I applied that once the speed paint was dry. Now it's going somewhere. I really like how this is looking over the gold metal color especially. But it still looks too dark on the red and dark gray surfaces, so once that dried I used my acrylic orange, yellow, and white colors again. I mixed a light orange color first, and made sure it was fairly thin, then started applying that to the raised surfaces close to the fire effect. Then I mixed a more yellowy highlight and applied that to only the closest areas. I could have made this glowing OSL effect much more dramatic, but honestly it was a little bit of an afterthought, and stylistically I just preferred keeping it a bit more subtle. Just a couple more steps to go. I painted and highlighted the book pages, painting a couple of lines to give the impression of pages, And then I painted some highlights on the cover of the book as well. I made these highlights very rough and scratchy, almost like it's an ancient and battered tome. Then I painted the base rim with 2 coats of black, and between coats I just couldn't resist sneaking in one more highlight, doing one final highlight on the very edges of the red waistcloak. I've decided that the Mini is at a great stopping point for me personally, so I'm calling her done. I do a quick matte varnish, and just for the fun of it I airbrush some satin varnish over the gauntlets to give them their shine back, and here's the final result. I'm happy to answer any questions as always, and I'm continuing to have tons of fun painting the minis from Guards of Atlantis. Take care of yourself, and make sure to give yourself a few compliments today because you deserve it. Have a good one, and see you next time.